At this point, I actually would like to go back to the 3D cursor because we covered what the 3D cursor is in general. We covered the grid and the snapping a little bit. And I showed you before, when you have an object which is slightly misplaced and it's not really, for example, X, Y, and Z 0, I could simply press Shift S and then say snap my selection, which is my object, to the grid, and then it snaps to the closest grid intersection. Now the same is, for example, possible with the 3D cursor as well. I could say Shift S, snap my cursor to the grid. And you see now that my cursor is always snapped to the grid. So I don't have to go into the 3D location section and type in those values by my own. I could, for example, also say, well, snap my cursor to my selected object or the active object. So let's actually add two objects, one here, and let's add one there. So in a previous video, I, for example, talked about the active object. See, this is now the active one. But they're all selected. Now I could say Shift S, snap to selected. And you see that my 3D cursor snaps to the center of this selection. Because it's like all three objects together, that creates a surface and it snaps to the center of that. Or I could say snap to the active one, which is the upper right corner cube. And it snaps to the center object of that object. I could, for example, also say, well, if I have my cursor here, well, this object, please snap to my cursor. And you see then my object is being moved up to that cursor. You can also, let's do this again, say this object move to the cursor. You see? It's actually pretty nice. So what else can we do actually with that 3D cursor? Well, let's set this one all to 0. Let's snap the cursor to the grid. And if I press R, you see I can rotate around that object, center point. Now down here where my mouse is right now, you see that if I click on it, I get a small pop-up dialog for different pivot points. Currently I have the bounding box. And that means if, for example, I have multiple objects, you see that the center of those two objects is somewhere in between. Now let's duplicate this object again. You see the center point is there. If I press R now, you see that it rotates around that center point. If I, for example, click on individual origins and then I press R, you see I rotate each object around its individual object center. So that, for example, could be useful in case you have multiple objects and you just want to rotate each object just around its own axis. And last but not least, there is now also the 3D cursor. And you see that this 3D widget, currently in location mode, switches to the position where my 3D cursor is. See, when I move my 3D cursor, it follows it. Cursor to grid. And if I press R now, you see everything rotates around that 3D cursor. If I, for example, press S to scale, it all scales to and away from that 3D cursor. So that's, for example, very useful when I would like to scale or rotate around a certain point, and I don't want, like you have to do in Alias, to reset the object pivot point to that position, perform your rotate command, and then maybe move that pivot point back. In Blender, you can simply use the 3D cursor for that, position it correctly, and then perform your scale or rotate command. And that is basically what the pivot point selection in Blender can offer you, that you have the ability to do transformation tasks based on an object, based on an object selection, based on each object's individual center point, or, for example, based on the 3D cursor.